Hello everybody, thank you for joining me on my channel. My name is Alex Cassian and today I'm going to be sharing with you the process of drawing this landscape sketch in gel pens. Today I'm going to be using two types of pens. So both are gel pens, but one is a thinner one, 0.25, and the other one is 0.7 gel pen. And we're going to be exploring different ways of drawing a landscape. So I'm just going to draw one of those landscapes that I photographed some time ago and see how it goes. So overall, the general idea is that I'm gonna start with a thin pen, get the overall placement, and then once I got that, we're gonna go into each detail and explore and expand. So I'm gonna place this tree in here as my kind of an anchor point. It will allow me to establish the rest of the composition. And then I'm also going to insert a tree in here, just like that. And another tree right here, as well as a tree right here. Then the horizon line, I'm gonna place it right in this spot, right here, just like that. Okay, so here's the horizon line. So this entire space is going to be occupied by water. And then here we have rocks and the earth. So here's some basic details. So the next step is going to be exploring each tree individually and then connecting the whole picture together. So I'm gonna start with this tree and treating it as my main tree and tree of reference, and I'm gonna establish the tones on this tree and then refer to it to make decisions about the following trees. So this tree would be my, this area rather would be my darkest area, and so it could be a really good spot for me to look at and make decisions basing on this tree. So I'm gonna just mark down the main characteristics, sort of describing the portraiture of this tree. And now I'm going back and forth between the thin and the thick lines. Here we go. And to be safe, for most of the drawing, I think I'm gonna try to get at least the first lines with a thinner pen, because it's much easier to make corrections if anything needs to be corrected later on. Yeah, because of course, with this type of drawing where we don't want to have any we don't want to have too many mistakes because there's no way to correct it. And so this is why we want to use this this kind of a thinner pen at the beginning. Okay, so here we go. With gel pens, what's really cool is that you really don't have to press hard. They can just, the moment you touch the paper, they just give you a really nice, consistent line. That being said, I actually really enjoy drawing with ball pens as well, and I find that this would be, to me, the main difference between drawing with ball pen versus gel pen. With ball pen, you can actually control the pressure, and obviously the harder you press, the darker the line. With gel pen, it feels a little bit different in the sense that your line pressure doesn't vary as much. So if you press with this pen, whether I press hard or just gently, I mean, there will be a difference, but not as dramatic as you can observe with the ball pen. So in here, I'm splitting my negative shapes and positive shapes, meaning the shape of the tree, which would be the positive shape, and the background that kind of describes the space between branches and trees. So that would be my negative space. Here we go. All right, so I'm gonna add a bit more in this area to separate this tree from the rest in here. Okay. And what that gives me is some kind of an idea about the value structure. So I'll have this basic separation between tones into kind of a lighter gray and white in the background, whereas on my tree I do have much darker contrast, much higher contrast between this part of the tree and the shadow. And I'm going to exaggerate that because I'm using ink and I'm a bit limited in my tonal range. And to compensate for it, I'm actually going to add more contrast in objects that are closer and then make the objects that are further much darker. This way, I will be able to create a sense of atmospheric perspective. Okay, so I'm gonna add another tree right here. Just like this. Perfect. And separating this tree from the background. So I'm going to leave the light in here. However, in the background, I will add a bit of the darkness so that my tree would come out a little bit more. You don't have to make the outline too thick in here. It's going to be clear even like that this tree is separate from the background. And so I will continue in here and do the same thing. All right, so here we go. And then I'm going to add this tree over here as well. All right, and now there's a bit of a drop shadow that is projected in here. Now, when hatching, you can actually take advantage of your hatching, and you can show not only the tone, the value of the shadow, but also the direction. So you can kind of use your lines in a directional way. And soon I'm going to be working on the water, and this would be a really great opportunity for us to show how lines and movement can be combined together. So you can, with lines, you can use both the motion range, and also you can describe the value range rather, and the motion range. So I'm gonna just mark this trunk of this tree in here. Okay. And of course, so this is a birch tree, and it's kind of cool because I can use my dark lines, my dark marker, or my dark pen, to describe the darker areas of the birch tree, and then leave the light lines on the lighter areas of the tree. Now, keep in mind that even if, of course, the birch tree has quite a bit of white on its texture, but of course, the moment you place anything white in the shadow, it will no longer be white. So therefore, we'll mark this tone with this pen as our kind of a white area, and then we'll use this pen, the darker lines, to mark all the dark parts on the tree. And now here, I'm going to replicate this kind of a shadow. When hatching, one of the things that works really well is if you keep your lines consistent in terms of their thickness and in terms of their gap space in between each line. And then what I like to do is I like to create a change of the motion so that it would feel like you're applying them on top of a surface, and they're not just random, they're actually covering a specific surface. There's another tree trunk here, and here's its shadow. All right, so now let's do some water. Now, water's a lot of fun. So the water, this is kind of a water with lots of waves. It's a water that's about to turn into a waterfall, so there's a lot of action, there's a lot of motion. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to be separating the darker spots on the water versus those white splashes of water. So I'm just going to identify the main chunks of those white splashes here. All right, so now I'm gonna add a bit of a direction in these lines, suggesting that there's kind of an active motion in this water, just like that. And just like that. And then with a bit of an outline. No, you don't have to have too much outline, but just a little bit of it would really help us describe better the nuances that we see in this type of water. So here we go. Same thing here. So of course this water is not flat, so there's a lot of variation, and I'm not copying exactly how it is, as long as you're able to mimic it to kind of describe the feel of of the water. That's good enough. Okay. And now I'm gonna go into the next spot in here. All right, so here we go. Now, what we're doing here is we're separating the drawing into so far 3 values. Now we have this darker value. Of course, we have the paper, which is the lightest light. And then we have this kind of a in-between tone. As we're gonna do our first pass, we're going to come back and we're going to expand the value range. But it's important to, at the beginning, to keep your drawing clear and organized and not to get too lost in the tonal range. So keeping it in a set of 3 tones is really helpful at the beginning. And then we're going to, as I said before, come back to this and expand on these on this variation. So I'm just going to do this corner. All right. And here I'm going to describe a couple branches. So what I'm doing is I'm creating an outline, and then I'm going in between positive and negative shapes, and I'm separating the values of this of the background versus the foreground. There we go. Okay, and now the same thing is here. So we have some water to describe over here. And here we go. All right, so now let's cover this area. So in here, I'm going to mark the largest shapes. As I said before, I'm not necessarily copying exactly what's happening. I'm rather getting the feel of the description of this type of water with a lot of changes, and I'm going to separate my dark areas, so the parts of the water that is still transparent, and then I'm separating it from the white parts of the water, which is very splashy, and I want to indicate that as much as possible. Now, what I'll do in the foreground, and I'll start with the foreground and see how it goes afterwards. I'll start with marking even darker areas in water. So for example, there's a bit of a rock that sticks out, and this rock does have kind of a darker shape, and even there are parts of the water that are a little bit darker. So I'm actually gonna mark through cross-hatching some parts of the water to really isolate it from the white area. Okay, just like this. Okay. So here in the foreground, we have a bit of grass and rocks. So we're going to mark that. There's a rock in here. There are groups of leaves. So we're going to mark those down as well. And what I'm looking for is a separation between the light and the shadow. So for example, in here I have the rock that is a bit lighter than the color of the earth and everything that's the whole group around the rock. So it's leaves, grass. So I'm gonna just separate that. And there are a couple of branches that are a little bit lighter than the earth. So I'm gonna separate that as well. Okay, so let's work on this side. Okay, so once again, I'm separating the darker parts of the water in here and leaving the light parts untouched. As I'm getting closer to the shore, I want to be a bit more descriptive. So there's a branch in here. There are all these waves in here. So let's split the lights and darks once again. Now I'm gonna revisit some of these darker shapes because some of the transitions, and this is something that I want to work on right now, some of the transitions are going to be really fast. So for example, if there's a splash that's happening in front of the transparent part of the water, the transition is going to be pretty quick. So the edge that describes the change from the white part of the water into the dark is going to be pretty sharp. However, the transition of the same wave from dark to transparent is going to be a bit slower. So I'm going to continue my tones into the white, allowing us read a bit of a transition, or like a slower transition rather. So the same thing is happening here. And as I'm going further up, I want to make my tones a bit lighter to keep my main darks in here. And I'm gonna come back to my initial tree trunk that I want to use as my anchor point that will hold the whole picture. And I will add some more darks in it to really bring the viewer to this main area in here. And I'm gonna be pushing my darks. But that being said, even if I'm pushing my darks, I'm still trying to keep my line work consistent, and I still want to keep the movement in my hatching. I'm just making the focal part of this tree, so the main tree here, much darker, so that we could clearly see and separate our background from our foreground. And my goal is to keep the background kind of light and push more darker values in the front. Okay, here we have a bit of a rock, so we're going to push it right here. There we go. And now let's render this tree. I'm gonna use this paper to cover my hands so that I wouldn't smudge the ink underneath. And I know that I could have started from this side, but it doesn't actually change that much, because if you don't protect your paper, the oil from your hands is just gonna change the structure of your paper, and the ink is not gonna sit on paper in the same way. So first of all, I try not to put my hand that much on the paper, and if I do, just protecting it with protecting paper with another piece of paper, or whatever you can protect it with is a good idea. It's a really good idea. This way you'll avoid any kind of folds and unpleasant surprises, or just different application of ink. I mean, it's a pretty quick sketch. It's only about half an hour, 45 minutes, but it's quite satisfying. And it's winter now, so in the summertime I like going outside and sketching outdoors with my sketchbook, but it's really fun to do one of those even from a photograph sometimes in my studio. So just describing the trees in the back. Now, for us not to get confused with background versus foreground, I'm going to mark darker lines on the tree here. All right, now there are a few branches that are taking place here. So I'm going to describe those. And I'm gonna make my branches lighter than the background. So I'll keep the slightly darker background, and my branches are gonna be slightly lighter. So I'm just going to apply this light hatching and leaving the branches kind of cut out a little bit. And then I'll just give it a bit more definition in here. You don't want to get these branches too defined, because they are not as important, but it's nice to have a bit of that additional detail. Okay, so now it's time to push this area significantly darker. And what I'll do is I'm gonna mark down the key points in here. And my goal is not necessarily to make the whole thing darker, but at least to make my shadows really dark in here. So for example, there's a rock in here. There's a tree branch sticking out in here with a shadow, some leaves. Then there's more detail here. Okay, so let's start with the rock. I'm gonna mark even the light part of the mid-tone part of the rock with my darker pen. And then I'm going to add another layer of hatching to mark the shadow. So I'm going to cross hatch a little bit to really push the shadow part of the rock even darker. And because I worked in this area mainly with my thinner pen, I can let myself use a thicker pen in here, knowing that it's just gonna work to my advantage, because it will ultimately bring everything that's in here, it's gonna bring it together. So it's gonna work out pretty nice. Now, I also don't wanna go too crazy on the darks in here. I will reserve the rest of the space for my lighter pen. So here's another rock. There we go. So then I will work on the midtones with my finer pen and leaving out the shapes of light. So even if I'm applying this pen next to my darker line, we can clearly see the difference between the light value versus the darker value. All right, so it's a good time for me to push further this shadow. All the way here. Okay, so let's pull the whole picture together right now. I'm gonna go over my entire drawing and I'm gonna push my darks even darker, and I'm gonna leave out my lights lighter. So for instance, this whole tree, I'm gonna actually get it a bit darker. Even some elements on the grass, and it's still going to be lighter than the water behind. Okay. Same thing here. Okay. And now the part that is left is this. So we'll just add more textures of the water. Okay, and let's push this tree a bit further as well. Let's mark a couple branches in here. Okay, let's push this tree a bit darker as well as this tree, so that we can really have some nice deeper darks in our drawing. Because obviously with ink, you can't necessarily go lighter, but you can go significantly darker, and sometimes much darker than you think. So in this case, I'm gonna push my rock value even darker, just to bring this whole area together. And at this point, I can't necessarily leave anything white unless if it describes a specific shape, like a branch or something like that. but I want to make sure that I'm in control of the whole picture. So my goal here is to make the sides of the lower part of my drawing a bit darker, and then the background lighter, and the main accent would be on the trees, of course. All right. Then I want to make sure that although the background is going to be darker, I want to make sure that my water still is lighter than, let's say, the forest in the background. So I'm going to revisit the lines that I applied in the backdrop. I'm still using the 0.25 gel pen. So for anyone curious, these are made by Pentel. So both are Pentel's gel pens. So this one is 0.25 and the other one is 0.7. Okay, and here just want to separate the water a little bit clearer, so I'm going to apply a bit of cross hatching through the whole separation line. There we go. Same thing here. At this point, even the light on my trees in the background is still going to be a little bit darker than the water. So I'm gonna separate it just like that. There we go. So I'm leaving my water as my lightest light, my tree trunks as my darkest dark, and everything else is in between. And the beauty of the thin pen like 0.25 is that at no point it will get darker, or it will take a lot of effort to make it darker than the thicker lines. So now we just kind of push the forest in the back, but I don't want to put too much detail not to confuse us with the foreground. We can revisit the water just to give it even more character. Just describing this quick outline. I mean, it's pretty tough to describe water, of course, with ink, with a limited material, but the key here is to just show the those shapes, those small white shapes, and the splashes. So let's describe even further the details in the foreground. So if there's any grass, leaves, there's a rock, and there's a nice branch over here, splits like that. even darker. Perfect. And then let's finish it by applying some hatching lines over here. Let's push some of these lines darker. And let's push this part of the tree darker as well. Thank you very much for joining me on this drawing journey today. I'm hoping to see you back on my channel soon. In the meantime, check out my Instagram at Alex Cassian, and see you soon.